Welcome back to the deadly and dangerous alligator pit. Peace be upon the ladies and gentlemen who are tuning in. Major salute to you for your continuous support. Much gratitude towards you. So for this classic episode, what we will do is review the Holy Crusades, and we will also look into some of the melanated Judean families of Christendom who inspired and motivated the Holy Crusades, all right? So we're going to go into the aristocratic nobles of Europa and look into the Holy Crusades, all right, which is a historical event we learn about where there were these wars between Christendom and Islam, all right? So we just going to look a little deeper into, this phenomenon and this enlightenment understanding that we know of as the hidden hand. Now, the hidden hand is also an esoteric symbol that goes back to the Old Testament, where the Semitic man Moses was told to put his hand in his coat. And when he put his hand in his coat, his melanated flesh turned pale. But after removing his hand, of course, it went back to its natural color. So I find it very interesting how the hidden hand symbolism is used in Freemasonry, is used in Rosicrucianism, and is used in a lot of different places. But I think that one of the occult symbols of the hidden hand is when you have these melanated nobles of Europa, these aristocrats who were in perpetual warfare, always fighting against other family members. And in order to, bring some type of solution to this, what they did was they started to prop up foreigners and outsiders and put them into the forefront and made it look like they were running things, where these melanated aristocrats of Europa, of Christendom, were in the back. They were still ruling in secrecy. Okay, so when we talk about the hidden hand, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the cat's paw. All right. So the preface to this video is I want you to think about this. When you think about the kingdom of Jerusalem that was initiated by David and Solomon, that goes back to probably around the year, let's say 1000 BC. All right. So, let's say 3000, plus years ago. You had the inauguration of the kingdom of Israel, which was started by David, who actually took the throne from Saul. And the Davidic line was going to be the line of kings. All right. And we know after David, his son Solomon ruled. And after Solomon, his son Rehoboam ruled. But during the days of Rehoboam, the people of Israel started to divide, and there started to be civil wars and cracks within the unity of the people. So they were divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. All right. So when you hear me talk about the Judeans, I'm talking about the southern kingdom, who were really living in Israel, or living in Jerusalem, rather. And these people were more of an elite, intellectual, educated class of people. They were very, very astute in the Torah. They could read, they could recite it. So you could look at the people that were in Judea, in Jerusalem, almost as like the brain trust of the Israelite people. And those that were in northern Israel, or the northern kingdom, they were left behind during the Babylonian captivity. Okay. So the first captivity was, when the Assyrians took away the northern kingdom and they brought foreigners into the land. And then later on in the 500s BC, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar took the aristocrats, the intellectual people of Judea, and he took those people to Babylon to help build up Babylon. But after the Persians came to topple the Babylonians, the Judean Israelite people were sent back into, the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel. And this is when they rebuilt the second temple. All right. So the first thing I want you to keep in mind is that when Nebuchadnezzar came to sack Jerusalem and he took the Judaic people out of there, you got to remember that I believe it was the king Hezekiah who was, he was asked by one of the prophets. I can't remember if the prophet was Jeremiah, but one of the prophets was basically like, why are you showing these Babylonians all the treasures and the precious items of Israel? Because they had, emissaries sent from Babylon, I think the sons of Nebuchadnezzar, into Israel. And, at this time, Hezekiah, I believe he was serving as a vassal king. So he's showing them all around, and, he's showing them everything that the Israelites have. And Jeremiah's like, why are you showing these people this stuff, bro? They ain't gonna do nothing but come back later on and take it. And he made a comment along the lines of like, well, it won't be in my, lifetime. It won't be during my generation. And this was true. So understand that during the time of Babylonian captivity, but before Babylonian captivity in the 500s BC, you had a lot of wealthy, rich Judaic men and women who had prized possessions. And a lot of them were stored and hidden away under the temple and probably around other parts of Jerusalem. So when the Babylonians came to take them out, a lot of their treasures were stored and hidden away so they wouldn't be confiscated and stolen. Later on, you have the Romans who now take over the province of, Jerusalem. And in 70 AD, the Romans sacked and destroyed the temple of Jerusalem. All right. And the descendants of these same Judean regal class, this regal house of Judah, who were intellectual, who had many skill sets, these people were now spread throughout the diaspora. A lot of them, went into Egypt. They went into Greece. They spread out basically. Babylon, Iran, so-called different areas of the Middle East. But some of these people also end up in Southern Europe. All right. And some of these Judean families started to, intermarry themselves with a lot of the, we'll say, inhabitants of so-called Europe. All right. That were there before them, that were there before 70 AD. So keep in mind that when the Judeans left Rome, there also were treasures, jewels, and prized possessions that they had to hide because the Romans were destroying everything and they were stealing everything. You have the famous picture where you have the Roman military, sacking the Temple of Jerusalem and taking out the large menorah candle. All right. So understand that in 70 AD, when they were, destroying the Israelites' possessions, their homeland, they were stealing and taking a lot of their stuff. All right. This is actually something that's repeated throughout history, that whenever the Judaic people are spread throughout the diaspora, these invaders always come in and steal their belongings. All right. Including some of their religious texts. All right. So keep in mind that when they left in 70 AD, they may have gone into Europa, but a lot of their jewels and treasures were left behind, hidden somewhere in the Temple of Jerusalem. All right. Now, after the first Crusades in the early 1100s AD, as we're going to read in a little while, there was a man by the name of Hugh of Champagne. Champagne is one of the cities or counties or areas of France. But Hugh of Champagne was one of the founders of the group called the Knights Templar. All right. Now, the Knights Templar are very, very important because they were a militaristic order of knights that led the Holy Crusades. And a lot of the knights that led it were part of this, aristocracy and nobility of Christendom. But what we're going to find out is that they all, had a recollection or a history or a memory of them being descendants of some of these Judaic nobles who left out of Jerusalem during Roman captivity. All right. And that they may have had a bloodline tied to King David. All right. So keep in mind, too, that, when you have these kings and queens, emperors and empresses throughout Earth history, when they put themselves on the throne, you have to be legitimate. Like people are wondering, like, well, what makes you the king? Like what bloodline or what inheritance do you have that makes you the king that puts you in this position? So throughout Christendom, whether it was the Holy Roman Empire, whether it was the Byzantine Empire, the Iberians, okay, even up in Britannica, a lot of these nobles, these kings, trace their lineage and trace their kingship back to the Davidic bloodline of the Judeans. Okay. So it may not be a surprise to think that these kings of Christendom wanted to go back into the Holy Land, wanted to go back into Jerusalem or Canaan to not only take the city back, but also to find some of these treasures, some of these hidden texts, books, and other possessions that were stored away by their Judaic ancestors before they left during Babylonian captivity and when they left during Roman captivity. All right. Now, a lot of my information comes from, of course, just studying and investigating. But I have a book that I'm going to read And I'm going to read the chapter on the Temple of Jerusalem. And the name of this book is called Order Ab Cal by Mr. David Livingston. All right. This is one of the greatest books I've ever read. And it's very voluminous. It's a very, very large book, many, many chapters. All right. But we're going to read about the Temple of Jerusalem and look a little deeper into some of the hidden history of the Holy Crusades and how these melanated families who descended from these Judeans were ruling in secrecy. And they, created the campaign that led to the Holy Crusades. All right. So we're going to just start from the top and analyze as we go down. Also, keep in mind this: when you hear about stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, when you hear about Parzival, when you hear about the Holy Grail, when you hear about Christendom and these stories about, these mythical knights and stuff like that, all of that, it ties right back to this history that we're talking about. OK, the hidden melanated nobles of Europa who ruled Christendom. So although they may have been Christians under Christendom, but that doesn't mean that they weren't from a Judaic bloodline, possibly. All right. Remember, the difference between a Christian and the so-called Jew is really just one accepts the prophet Jesus and one doesn't. But as far as their bloodline, they come from the same group of people. OK, so let's read. As demonstrated by Henry Perrine and Muhammad and Charlemagne, Europe's collapse into a so-called Dark Ages was largely attributable to the Muslim conquest of the Mediterranean, which choked Europe's access to international markets. After Charlemagne's death, his precarious empire fragmented under the attack of the Vikings and Magyars. In its wake, the peasantry were subjected to a system of feudalism solidified, particularly in France and the Low Countries. In the countryside, private castles were erected by local seigneurs without imperial permission to fend off barbarian attacks. Small trading centers grew around the castles and eventually served as sites for periodic fairs. By the end of the 11th century, Western Europe was gaining greater economic integration. This internal explosion of urbanization provided the financial strength that emboldened the West to undertake the Crusades in an attempt to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. So the first thing that I want you to understand is that what they call the Dark Ages basically was just the Ottoman Empire, Muslims, coming into various parts of North Africa, the Mediterranean, Southern Europe, and they started to rule and expand. So a lot of the, people of Christendom had their business ties and, trading networks cut off. All right. So this is what led to what they call the so-called Dark Ages. But after the Holy Crusades, after that first Crusades, when a lot of those knights returned from the so-called Middle East, they had a lot of new things with them in their possession. All right. And one of them was the understanding of business and international trade. All right. As you're going to see in a minute. The Crusades were a number of attempts to recapture the Holy Land, which had fallen to Islamic expansion as early as the 7th century. The First Crusade, 1095 to 1099 AD, was called for at the Council of Clermont on November 27, 1095, by Pope Urban II, a former monk of the influential Abbey of Cluny, who called for a military expedition to aid the Byzantine Empire, which had recently lost most of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks. Clermont was some 200 miles from Troyes, in the influential county of Champagne, town of Rashi de Troyes, or Rashi of Troyes, the great alumnus of the Kalonymus Academy of Mainz, and was reputedly descendant from the royal line of King David. So I'm going to reread that part. It says Clermont was some 200 miles from Troyes in the influential county of Champagne, town of Rashi, who was reputed as a descendant of the royal line of King David. So keep in mind right now the county of Champagne and this term Rashi. Rashi was a Jewish rabbi who lived in Champagne. All right. And Rashi was also one of the Jewish rabbis or Judaic rabbis who became closely affiliated with a lot of the nobles who were ruling in France, because they would all hang out. And one of the hangout places was this influential Abbey of Cluny, all right, which is also where Pope Urban II started to spread his message about, we need to go on this crusade and take back the Holy Land. All right. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, also known as Rashi, was the leading Jewish figure who dominated the second half of the 11th century, as well as the whole rabbinical history of France. He was descended from the Makir Kalanimus line through his mother, whose brother was Simeon the Great, rabbi of Mainz. His teachers were students of his relative Gershom ben Judah. All right. So as you can see right now, you have these, Semitic Judeans, all right, who are, purported to be descended from the royal line of King David through these rabbis. All right. So also keep in mind that a lot of the lineage descent to keep the bloodline pure of the Mashiach through King David is coming through a lot of these rabbis. All right. And keep that in mind. And also Rashi was one of the most influential Judaic rabbis of France. All right. In the late 1000s, early 1100s. OK. Rashi was the author of complete commentaries on the Bible and on the Babylonian Talmud. And famously, his first comment on the first verse of Genesis, which might be the best known exegesis of the Torah, asserts the God-given right of the Jewish people to possess the land of Israel. So what I'm going to read right now is that this guy Rashi, who was a descendant of a rabbi that was, part of the bloodline of King David, Rashi used to give his own commentaries. But in the early, the early parts of before the Crusades, he would start to say things that reflected, Kabbalistic thought, which is that Hashem, or God Almighty, gave the land to the Canaanites, but he can also take it away from the Canaanites and give it to the Israelites. Okay, so keep in mind that, Jerusalem is an Israelite city, but that place was always a holy city even before the Israelites came there. Think about in the Old Testament, when you hear about Abraham and paying offerings, or giving offerings rather, to Melchizedek, who was the high priest, also known as the king of Salem. So at this time, when Abraham went into the land of Canaan, Salem was already there. All right. So it's not like the Israelites made Jerusalem a holy city, because if you think about the part of the world where Canaan is, it's a it's the Middle East is like a nucleus of international trade and business in the ancient world. So think about where modern day Jerusalem is. All right. To the west, you have Egypt. To the north, you have Lebanon going into Turkey, and then various parts of the Mediterranean, which can take you into, the islands of Crete, Italy, Greece, and then on over into the Iberian Peninsula, which you got Spain and Portugal. And then to the east of Jerusalem, you have Iraq, known as Mesopotamia, the Euphrates. Okay, so remember the Jews, they alleged that they were given the land from the river Euphrates on down to the Nile River. That basically takes up majority of the Middle East, parts of Syria, Lebanon, and what we call Canaan. So the point is that the Hamitic line of Canaan, those people already were living in that part of the world. But you had, Israelite rabbis and priests that started to tell the people that, hey, Hashem gave them the land, but he's going to take it away and then give it to us. So when you see Joshua, Caleb, and the Israelites going in to sack Canaan after they left Egypt, remember, it was a people already there. And they had a city called Salam, or Salem, the city of peace. And Melchizedek was the king of Salem, or the high priest. And that's who Abraham went to acknowledge after he had the war to free Lot and some of his people. So just keep in mind that, this concept of the Holy Land, being given to the Judaic people or the Israelite people It goes back really even before modern day so-called Zionism. All right, it goes back to these days of the Holy Crusades. So I'm going to reread this last sentence before we go into it. It says, Rashi was the author of complete commentaries on the Bible and the Babylonian Talmud, and famously his first comment on the first verse of Genesis, which might be the best known exegesis of the Torah, asserts the God-given right of the Jewish people to possess the land of Israel. Rabbi Isaac said, the Torah should have begun with the verse, quote, this month shall be to you the first of months, quote, Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, which was the first commandment given to Israel. Why then did it begin with, quote, in the beginning, end quote? It began thus because it wished to convey the idea contained in the verse in Psalms 111, verse 6, quote, the power of his acts he told to his people in order to give them the estate of the nations, end quote. So that if the nations of the world will say to Israel, quote, you are robbers because you took by force the land of the seven nations, end quote, Israel might reply to them, quote, the whole earth belongs to the Holy One. Blessed be he. He created it and gave it to them, and by his will, he took it from them and gave it to us. So you can see right here that, the Israelite spiritual religious leaders were creating justifications and telling the nation that God Almighty bestowed this land upon the foreigner, on the Goyim or the Gentile, but he's going to take it back and give it to us. All right. So this is what was being told to the aristocrats and the nobles prior to the Crusades. All right. The same way how today you have, a certain group of people in that part of the world basically fighting to take the land from the Palestinians so they could create their greater Israel project. Because what you have today is the Caucasian version of Jewish expansion. But what I'm telling you is that over 1,000 years ago, you had the melanated expansion of the Jewish empire, okay, or the Judaic empire. All right. So today you got Caucasian people doing it, but in the ancient world, it was melanated people doing it, and the medieval world over 1,000 years ago. Let's keep going. Rashi's hometown of Troyes was the site of the famous Champagne fairs, which sparked an international trade that, according to Janet Abu Lughad, in before European hegemony, represented a critical turning point in world history, giving rise to Europe as a modern economy and assisting it in leaving behind the Dark Ages. The King of France granted the privilege of the Champagne fairs to the Knights Templars, a crusading order founded in 1119 and named after their headquarters in the site of the old Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. At the time, Champagne was governed by Hugh, Count of Champagne, founding member of the Knights Templars, who frequently received Rashi as an honored guest. So we know that Rashi, who is this Judaic rabbi, who was giving these commentaries and telling the people of Christendom in France that the Holy Land is supposed to be given back to the Israelite people. All right. When the Knights Templars returned from their first crusade back to Champagne, France, they had a lot of knowledge of international trade and business that obviously they learned from the Middle East. And they brought these business practices back to Champagne, France. And according to this author named Janet Abu Lughad, in her book Before European Hegemony, she says that these Templars represented a critical turning point in world history and gave rise to Europe as a modern economy and assisted in leaving back the Dark Ages. And it says that the King of France gave these privileges of the Champagne fairs or these international business activities. He gave these activities to the Knights Templars, who were a crusading founding order in 1119. So you hear about the Knights Templars being associated with being bankers, merchants, and businessmen, how they were able to accrue and amass a lot of wealth and riches. A lot of that was from what they had obtained during the Holy Crusades. And a lot of that also was the power given to them by the King of France to be over the business affairs. All right. And this is what helped usher Europe out of what they call the Dark Ages. All right. Now, the leader of Champagne at that time was Hugh of Champagne. All right. And Hugh of Champagne would frequently have Rashi, or this Jewish rabbi, who would preach about the return of the Holy Land to the Jews. He would frequently have him as an honored guest in the court of France. So you have this Judaic rabbi hanging out with Hugh of Champagne in the court of France, and he's giving this message to these French nobles and aristocrats that, hey, the Holy Land is supposed to go back to the Judean people. All right. Because remember, at this time, the Muslims had it. Hugh of Champagne was a member of a network of primarily Frankish nobles who embarked on the expedition to the Holy Land, since known as the Princes Crusades, founding a legacy of chivalry remembered in the legends of the Holy Grail, the symbol of their dynastic descent from King David, the bloodline expected to produce the Messiah. In Judaism, HaMashiach, often referred to as Melech Mashiach, is to be a Jewish leader descended from the paternal Davidic line through King David and King Solomon. He is expected to accomplish the unification of the tribes of Israel, the gathering of all Jews, Eretz Israel, the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, the ushering in of a messianic age of global peace, universal peace, and the annunciation of the world to come. Thus, the families of the Princes Crusade, although ostensibly Christian, appear to have participated in an attempt to reconquer the Holy Land and establish one of their own as King of Jerusalem, in expectation of the coming of the Messiah. So let's go from the top down. So Hugh of Champagne, which was the Count of Champagne, France, was a member of a network of primarily Frankish nobles who embarked on the expedition to the Holy Land, and this first crusade was known as the Princes Crusade. All right. And this established a legacy of chivalry remembered and talked about and mythologized in the legends of the Holy Grail. But these stories, these legends, were symbols of their dynastic descent from King David, the bloodline expected to produce the Messiah. All right. So in Judaism, the Mashiach, or HaMashiach, is said to be a Jewish leader descended from the paternal line of King David through King Solomon, through King David and his son King Solomon, And he's expected to accomplish the reunification of the tribes of Israel, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, usher in a messianic age of global universal peace, and the annunciation of the world to come. So right now you have different factions. You have Zionist Christian factions. You have Zionist Jewish factions. All right. And they have this idea of the messianic age. Now, remember, the Judeans, they believe the HaMashiach has not come yet. So they are trying to prepare the table for the HaMashiach to come. The Christians believe that Jesus will have a second coming. So they want to participate in reclaiming the Holy Land to serve as like this John the Baptist to pave the way for Jesus to return. And then the Muslims also have a concept of the really they believe that Jesus will return as well. So that's why you have all these parties involved and a lot of this stuff going on in the Middle East. All right. And they think that by creating all these wars and this chaos, that it's going to usher in this messianic age of global universal peace. All right. So it ends with saying that although these families of the Princes Crusades, remember the Crusades had, Christians coming from a lot of countries in Europe, but they were led by the French or the Franks because they were the most, wealthy. They were the most rich. They had the most resources. They were the more put together people. So they led the Crusades. And a lot of these leaders of the Crusades were nobles and aristocrats that were related to the Hugh of Champagne. And all these people traced their lineage back to these Judaic rabbis, all right, who are said to be from the bloodline of King David. Okay. So what they did is they ushered the Holy Crusades to not only reclaim the Holy Land, I think to find certain treasures and certain Jewish texts that may have been, lost, and also to, as it says, establish one of their own as the king of Jerusalem. Because remember, when the Christians took Jerusalem in 1099, they held on to it for about 200 years before the Muslims came back in like 1291, and they took the land back in the Battle of Acre, I want to say. ACRE. All right, let's continue. There is a legend recounted in Shalshilet ha-Kabbalah in Gedalia ibn Yaha, where Godfrey de Bouillon, the leader of the First Crusade, purportedly connected to the Davidic bloodline, visited Rashi to ask him advice about his attempt to lead the First Crusade. Rashi predicted that Godfrey would conquer Jerusalem and rule over it for 3 days, and then lose it to the Muslims on the 4th day, and he would return with only 3 horses. Godfrey responded, "What you say may come true, but if I return with even 4 horses, I will feed your flesh to the dogs and kill every Jew in France." 4 years later, Godfrey returned with 4 horses, but as he hastened into the city to harm Rashi, the 4th horse and its rider were killed by a falling stone to the gate. When Godfrey seeks out Rashi to, quote, bow down before him, he discovers that Rashi has already passed away. So Godfrey de Bouillon is one of the he's one of the more important leaders of the First Crusade, and he's actually the first king of Jerusalem. But he only held on to the kingship for like a year. And when he died, it was passed on to his brother, Baldwin I. All right. And Baldwin I ended up marrying a female heiress of Armenia. All right. And this marriage between Baldwin I and this heiress of Armenia created the first bloodline to, perpetuate the kingdom of Jerusalem after they took it from the Muslims and held on to it for about almost 200 years. Okay, let's see where we're going to go now. Let's see. Yeah, let's go right here. All right. So just remember that name, Godfrey of Bouillon, because it was a lot of leaders during the Crusades. Remember, it was a lot of knights. All right. And in order to consolidate themselves and create, a unified identity, even though they were all Christian, but they could have been from different counties. They could have been from different countries. And even though they may have been Protestant, some of them probably was Catholic, but they created these new orders to consolidate themselves, to go against the Muslims. So for all of you all that may have wondered, well, what is the history of Freemasonry? What is the history of the Rosicrucian? What is the history of Order of the Dragon? What is the history of the Order of St. George? Why did they create these groups? Why did these Christians create these groups? And the reason why is so they could consolidate and go against the Seljuk Turks and go against the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. That is why. And I guarantee most people who are Rosicrucians and Muslims and Shriners today, they may not even know that. So the truth is that all those orders and groups were started by people who were interrelated. They didn't have that concept of you could just come and, participate in a couple of rituals and ceremonies, and all of a sudden you can call yourself a Rosicrucian, or all of a sudden you can call yourself a Freemason. That's not how it worked. They were interrelated. All right. And the Order of St. George, which was started by one of the ancestors of Sigismund of Luxembourg, who created the Order of the Dragon, this order was only for high nobles of Europa. So they definitely didn't let anybody in that. All right. And you may want to also, you may ask yourself too, why do these Christian knights, the Order of St. George, and St. George is known to do what? To fight against the dragon, right? Then you have the Order of the Dragon that was started by Sigismund of Luxembourg, all right, which is also tied to Vlad the Impaler. And Vlad the Impaler's father was cool with Sigismund of Luxembourg. So Vlad the Impaler and his father, they were part of the Order of the Dragon. And what were they all trying to do? go against the Ottoman Turk Muslim expansion in Eastern Europe. All right. And even though they lost, these orders still continue to exist. Let's keep going. Godfrey, who was joined by his brothers Eustace III and Baldwin of Boulogne in the First Crusade in 1096, played a key role during the successful siege of Jerusalem in 1099. He was the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from 1099 to 1100, but avoided using the title of king, choosing instead that of princeps. Now remember, they didn't want to, Godfrey of Bouillon didn't want to use that title king because they really are just holding the kingdom down until the Mashiach returns. Okay, so they weren't really supposed to be calling themselves the king of Jerusalem because, according to their tradition, the king of Jerusalem is the Mashiach. All right. For his exploits, he was included among the ideal knights known as the Nine Worthies, 9 personages who personified the ideals of chivalry established in the Middle Ages, along with the Trojan Hector, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, Joshua, King David, and Judah Maccabee, King Arthur, and Charlemagne. Godfrey's role in the crusade was described by Albert of Aachen, the anonymous writer of the Gesta Francorum, written in 1100 to 1101, and Raymond of Aguiliers, a participant in the First Crusade, who co-wrote, I'm not going to even try to repeat that French word. It's on the screen, though, if you want to see it. William of Tyre. So basically, he's just going through all these different authors who wrote about, the Holy Crusades. And when they came back, they started to write about it. And of course, a lot of them were French. That's why these books are in French. But I do want to read this part right here. It says that William of Tyre, writing his History of the Crusade about 1190, records to the tale of the Knight of the Swan, from whom Godfrey and his brothers were descended. Now, the Knight of the Swan is very interesting because when you look into a lot of these nobles of Europa, the aristocrats, although they were Christian, but they had a lot of occultic background origins to their story. So remember, all of them are said to descend from this gentleman by the name of, his name was Guillaume of Galine. All right, I'm going to put him on the screen in a minute. But basically, the reason why you see the Order of the Dragon associated with the dragon, even though they're Christian, you see a lot of these heraldic signs with Christian nobles using dragons and serpents and stuff like that, because it all goes back to the Babylonian myth of Marduk versus Tiamat, which is you have the dragon representing Tiamat, or the old order, being toppled by Marduk, which is the new masculine patriarchal order coming in. So they didn't really have these, 100% Judaic origins. A lot of them had Kabbalistic stories as to what their family origins were. All right. So that's why you've heard me say in the past, they may have, had an outward appearance of Christians, but a lot of these occultic orders behind closed doors, they were into other types of, religious practices. That's why the Knights Templars were attacked, because they were seen associated with the skull, what they call the skull of Sidon. But that skull goes back to ancient Canaanite ritualistic ceremonial practice. All right. So I'm not necessarily saying that the symbols are evil or good, but it's just they weren't fully Christian like you may think. Ultimately, the Princes Crusades not only succeeded in the recapture of Anatolia, but also conquered the Holy Land and culminated in July 1099 in the reconquest of Jerusalem and the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasted for almost 200 years until the siege of Acre in 1291. We talked about that. The Armenians in Cilicia gained powerful allies amongst the Frankish Crusaders, whose leader, Godfrey de Bouillon, was considered a savior for the Armenians. With the Crusaders' help, the states of the Armenians secured Cilicia from the Byzantines and Turks, both by direct military actions in Cilicia and by establishing Crusader states in Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. In 1098, Baldwin of Boulogne left the main crusading army and went first south into Cilicia, then east to Edessa, where he convinced its lord Thoros to adopt him as son and heir. He also married Thoros' daughter, Arda of Armenia, who eventually became the first queen of Jerusalem when his brother Godfrey of Bouillon died in 1100. So remember when I told you all that the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, who was the first leader of the crusade, he only held on to that title for about a year. But when he died, it was passed on to his brother Baldwin. Baldwin then, remember, they're Frankish. Baldwin went into Armenia to help the Armenians, and then he married the heiress to the Armenian king. All right. This created a new union. All right. And it says that Thoros' daughter eventually became the first queen of Jerusalem when Godfrey of Bouillon died and his brother took over the throne. Okay. So now you got one more paragraph. While Baldwin of Bouillon headed east from Asia Minor to set up the county of Edessa, the main army of the First Crusade continued south to besiege Antioch in late 1097 October, led by Stephen of Blois. Adhemar of Lisieux is said to have carried the Holy Lance in the Crusaders' desperate outbreak at Antioch on June 28, 1098. The first ruler of the Principality of Antioch was Bohemond of Taranto, the son of Robert Guiscard. Bohemond I married Constance of France, the daughter of Philip I of France. The county of Tripoli, the last of the Crusader states, was founded when the Frankish Crusaders captured the region in 1109, and Bertrand of Toulouse, the son of Raymond IV of Toulouse, became the first count of Tripoli as a vassal of Baldwin I of Jerusalem. The county of Edessa passed on to his cousin Baldwin II of Jerusalem, and that was from 1075 to 1131. So I just wanted to go into some of this history of these, melanated families behind the Holy Crusades who had some kind of a, knowledge of them having Semitic heritage that went back to the bloodline of King David. Okay. And they went back into Jerusalem, I think, to find some of the treasures that were hidden from their ancestors that, had to get out of there during the Babylonian and Roman captivity. They also went into the Middle East and learned from what they called the Eastern mystics. All right, these Templars. And the Eastern mystics basically were certain Sufi, Shia, magical practicing Muslims. And they also learned from certain Judeans who were still in the Middle East when the Templars arrived. So when you think about, the Kabbalah, and you think about certain Jewish mystic practices, when you think about the astrological practices, the spread of Hermeticism, the spread of Neoplatonism, a lot of this was brought back into Europe by the Templars. Because remember, the Templars were the first real occultic order of Christendom in Europe. So anybody today, whether it's the Knights of Malta, as I say, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, all of these are descendant groups of the Knights Templars. All right. So these people are the true hidden hand. And all these names, as I say, Bohemond of Taranto, married Constance of France, the daughter of Philip I of France. Like all these people were melanated. They were melanated. Now, did some of them marry foreigners, Caucasians? Yes, they did. But I'm not going to say that all of them did. And did they just totally bleach themselves out? No, they did not. All right. They're still probably ruling in secrecy, using the hidden hand, using the cat's paw. And that's just what I think it is. So believe it or not, most of us here in the Americas, as I've said before, we are the generations that result from the marriage between the people of Europa and the people of America. All right. So think about it. Like you had the aristocracy and the nobles of Europa married the aristocracy and the nobles of America. And that produced the copper colored Americans or so-called Black Americans of today. All right. So the Holy Crusades does have a link and a tie to our people here in the Americas. All right. That goes back to the 13 colonies that goes back to the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War. And, you know, a lot of our people were going against the Catholics. Okay. Because think about it. When you think about the United States of America, do you think about Catholicism or do you think about Protestantism? You think about the Protestants. All right. So a lot of these people during the Crusades were Calvinist and part of other Protestant groups. And I'm going to end it with this. The man that said to have led the Protestant movement, Martin Luther, remember, he was being supported by these melanated aristocracy families, these nobles of Europa, all right, who are also Protestants and who also wanted to go against the Catholic Church, who wanted to go against the Pope. Okay. So that's really what, you know, I would say these different like wars throughout Europe in the mid to late 1800s, World War I and World War II, a lot of that was to totally destroy these different kingdoms and principalities that these families, these nobles of Europa had. All right. And they sent all their descendants, you know, to live on the 13 colonies. And a lot of us still retained our last names. But, you know, the family, like people have gotten lost on who they really are. So that's what I'm saying. A lot of you all listening to this right now, you could be a descendant of the House of Orange. You could be a descendant of the House of Bourbon. You could be a descendant of the House of Luxembourg. You see what I'm saying? Like you may have ancestors that was part of the Order of the Dragon. You know, the Order of the Golden Fleece. All right. So keep that in mind. All right. So, you know, hopefully you learn a lot from this video. And like I just mentioned, the Order of the Golden Fleece. We know about the Golden Fleece from Jason and the Argonauts, right? But I just said that the whole story of King Arthur and the Round Table, Parsifal, Jason and the Argonauts, the Order of the Golden Fleece, all of these are just symbolic myths and tales that were created after the Holy Crusades to talk about the exploits and the adventures that the melanated people of Europa, of Christendom, you know, experienced when they went into the Holy Land, and they wrote about it. All right. So y'all stay tuned for the next one. Hit us up in the comment section. We out.